on the Shenandoah Valley. He's been the leader of many trips down by the Shenandoah Valley and associated areas. He's a graduate of George Mason University, which is a well-known Virginia university. He's been a good friend to our roundtables, and he's more than welcome to give a talk anytime. And we want to thank him for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Al. I appreciate it. Well, thank you all for having me back for the Greater Boston Civil War Roundtable. Again, my topic tonight is Jubal Early, John Gordon, in the Battle of Cedar Creek. Now, having spent 30 plus years researching, spending a lot of time going through veterans newspapers and files, by far, what you see the most of, obviously, is the Battle of Gettysburg that the veterans were writing about. But one of probably a close number two, or at least based upon the number of participants, is the Battle of Cedar Creek, both Union and Confederate sides. It's very controversial, and the veterans kept rehashing that one over and over again. So it had a high degree of controversy, just like a lot of things that happened at Gettysburg. Went on till the day the last veteran died, and we still debate many of these things to this very day when we go out onto these battlefields. Now, first I will talk a little background about Jubal Early in 1864. Jubal Early's from Southwest Virginia, about 20 miles south of Roanoke, a little town called Rocky Mountains, where he had a pre-war law practice. Today, that county that he was from was known as the moonshine capital of the South. And that's the environment. It was very remote. He was a well-off family in a region that was very distant and not on the same levels that some of the more richer areas of pre-war Virginia were. He was a graduate of West Point. He had served in the Army briefly. One of the things about Early that had struck him and shattered him for life is that he had met a girl in the late 1830s at one of the resort areas in southwestern Virginia, the Sulphur Spring resorts, and they'd agreed they were going to meet there again the following year. And instead, the next spring came around, and he got a letter in the mail from her address, and all that was in there was a newspaper clipping announcing her engagement to another man. So said that Early was heartbroken and then swore off women from there on out, at least in terms of relationship, because he did manage to have 4 children with one woman sporadically over a 17-year period. She finally, after the Civil War, I think kids were born before, during, and after the Civil War. And she finally asked him if he would marry her, and because she had another opportunity with another man. And so he told her, well, you better take that opportunity because I'm not marrying anybody. But he was known as Robert E. Lee's bad old man. He was one of the few people who could get away with cussing and swearing around Mars Robert there, and he was just accepted. But he was a highly effective combat officer, leading a brigade at the First Battle of Manassas that counterattacks at the end of the fight on Chin Ridge. He's on the Peninsula Campaign in 1862 until early May, when he's wounded seriously at the Battle of Williamsburg. But he really starts coming into his own when, after he's wounded, he's moved under command of a large Virginia brigade in Stonewall Jackson's wing of the Army of Northern Virginia. And it's there that he really shines, at first at the Battle of Cedar Mountain, and then even more so again at Second Manassas, and then at Antietam, helping Early craft a defense there against the onslaught of the Second Corps in the West Woods. Again, he's going to restore broken battle lines at the Battle of Fredericksburg. He will hold the town of Fredericksburg with his division against the entire 6th Army Corps in the Battle of Salem Church area in spring of 1863. Controversy, of course, will never be far from Jubal Early, and he first finds it in a large scale at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1, where, it just part of the whole thing, should Ewell have kept going forward and attacking, and he was subordinate, and he found himself embroiled in that controversy in the post-war years. And coming out of Gettysburg, he was a very harsh critic of Longstreet's performance on day 2, which can be a whole talk in and of itself, is the Jubal Early and James Longstreet rivalry that sprung up after the war. In 1864, Early performs very well in the Battle of the Wilderness, and when A.P. Hill becomes sick, Robert E. Lee will put him in charge of the Third Army Corps. Lee had actually considered Early for command of the First Corps when Longstreet was wounded, but staff officers warned Lee that Early would not fit in very well in Longstreet's corps with its strong non-Virginia units in there. And so it was thought better to have Dick Anderson take that over. And then when Hill became sick, he got the Third Corps temporarily, did a great job with it at Spotsylvania, and Ewell, who had not performed up to Lee's expectations at Spotsylvania, would be removed, and Early would become the permanent commander of Stonewall Jackson's Second Army Corps. When they learned that Union forces from the Shenandoah Valley were threatening to capture Lynchburg, Virginia, a vital railroad and logistical support center for the Army of Northern Virginia, at the very same time that Grant was moving on Petersburg, Lee sends Early to save Lynchburg, which he does, defeating the Federals in the Battle of Lynchburg. Early also had orders from Robert E. Lee not just to save Lynchburg, but to move into the Shenandoah Valley and, like Stonewall Jackson in 1862, advance northward, stir things up. And he does a tremendous job of that, winning a smashing victory on July 9th at the Battle of Monocacy. And on the 11th, his army would arrive at the very gates of Washington, D.C. One of his staff officer in his army, Captain James B. Clay, the grandson of the great compromiser of Kentucky, Henry Clay, wrote home to his mother and said, we are a damn sight closer to the dome of the Yankee Capitol than they have ever been to ours. So now Early's army is only about 15,000 men strong, and it's obviously not strong enough to break through the defenses and hold Washington, D.C. without ultimately being swallowed up by massive reinforcements that are on the way. But Early's actions are going to withdraw 20,000 troops that Grant had pinned for his operations at Petersburg to save Washington at this point in time. So Early is going to quietly slip back into the Shenandoah Valley as we get into mid-July of 1864. He'll win victory, rearguard action at Cool Springs on the 18th, and he'll fall back to Fisher's Hill by the 20th of July, and there he waits, and Robert E. Lee tells him, says, "You're doing great work." He says, "If you want to keep the Second Corps out in the Shenandoah Valley, be my guest. My only requirement is that all those troops that Grant had sent to Washington, D.C., you need to make sure they don't show up back here where I have to deal with them in front of Petersburg." So Early, 4 days later, goes out, and as those reinforcements started heading back to Washington, D.C., Early attacked the small core of the Union troops in the valley and routs them at the Second Battle of Kernstown. And the end result of that action is going to be Grant's going to send 10,000 more troops and Phil Sheridan out here. So for every soldier that Robert E. Lee sent to the Shenandoah Valley under Early, and of Early's force, about 10,000 of his men were Army of Northern Virginia soldiers. Every soldier Lee sent out there, Grant had to send 3 Yankees to deal with the KG Jubal Early. So Early would hold Phil Sheridan at bay for more than a month until September 19th, when he would be routed by Sheridan at the Third Battle of Winchester. And 3 days later at the Battle of Fisher's Hill, where so between the two battles, Early's going to lose between well over 5,000 men, a full third of his effective fighting force. At this point, Jubal Early, who had done so well for 3 months, from June 17th until September 19th at the Third Battle of Winchester, he had been king of the Shenandoah Valley, and he had been able to maintain his success for a much longer period of time than what Stonewall Jackson was expected to do in 1862. And additionally, he had done it against much more significant odds. General Robert E. Lee does not understand fully the odds that Early is up against. At Third Winchester, for example, Sheridan has 35,000 men. Early has 15 to 16,000 men in his army. And Lee just does not understand that, and he thinks that Early has made some sort of mistake. Well, he has, but he's made some mistakes, but that's a whole other thing, because a lot of that gets into what Lee's expectations were as well. So Robert E. Lee, after the battle, the twin defeats in September, Robert E. Lee tells Early that one victory in the valley will set things right. And if there was one thing that could motivate General Early, it was the pleasure for Early of serving General Lee well and helping Lee out to be successful in the prosecution of the war. And so in spite of the fact, Lee was stretched thin at Petersburg, and there wasn't much he could do. He sends him about 3,000 infantry and about 1,000 artillery and cavalry men out there to reinforce, which makes good on most of the losses that he had suffered in September of 1864. But even with the reinforcements in the cavalry, on October 9th, those fresh cavalrymen under Tom Rosser would be routed at the Battle of Tom's Brook, or the Woodstock races, as it somewhat mockingly became known in the Confederate Army. So Early had problems. Sheridan had advanced as far south as Harrisonburg and Stanton in the Shenandoah Valley. And as he falls back to Winchester, he's going to conduct the infamous burning, where all the barns and mills were burned out, and all the crops, what couldn't be carried off, was destroyed. All the livestock was driven ahead of the Union Army, and as Grant had instructed Sheridan, the valley was left so barren that a crow flying over it would have to carry its own provender. So Early's slowly pursuing Sheridan as he falls back to the banks of Cedar Creek, which is just a few miles north of Strasburg and the northern edge of Massanutten Mountain. Now, there, Early comes up there, but because of Sheridan's actions in cleaning out the valley, they made sure that the Confederates could not stay long in that area, because unlike all the other times when the Confederates had advanced to the Shenandoah Valley, they lived off the largest of that agricultural bounty. Now, Sheridan had cleared that out, and there was nothing for the army to eat except what it brought with itself. Early communicates that much to Robert E. Lee and says, if I don't take any action soon, I'm going to have to fall back all the way down toward Newmarket, Harrisonburg area, another 50 miles or so that he can be closer to his lines of supply to get the food to keep the army fed. So he's going to come up with a plan. Here, let me share my screen here at this point. Okay, so if you look at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see Massanutten Mountain. Massanutten Mountain's about 50 miles long, runs essentially from the Strasburg Front Royal area south to just east of Harrisonburg. About where you see the T, the second T at the end of the word Massanutten, there is known as Signal Knob. And Confederates, John Gordon and Jed Hotchkiss and a couple other staff officers, at the direction of General Jubal Early, are going to be sent up there to scout the Union forces. If you look there on the map, you'll see, I don't know if you can see the little mover that I'm making, but about up there next to the word McMillan, you'll see Bell Grove. That's Sheridan's headquarters, and all around it is the camps. All these blue spots are the camps of the Union Army. And so Gordon and Hotchkiss, looking through telescopes down the mountain, they could see the exact layout. And the Union forces all had corps flags and with different colors designating different divisions. And they had such a clear plan of where the entire Union Army was laid out that John Gordon wrote, they could eat, whether it's true or not about it, like a lot of things Gordon says, but just it's somewhat hyperbolic, but he said he could see the sores on the backs of the horses in the Union camps. The view was so clear there. But most importantly, though, they knew exactly the exact layout of the Union forces there. So they're going to go back down to camp, back around Strasburg, at Fisher's Hill, south of, which would be off this map. And Gordon and Hotchkiss, largely Hotchkiss, because there's another division commander, John Pegram, who had gone farther out to the west off the map, and he wanted to attack from the west, from the Allegheny Mountain area, and come in on the Union from the west. And Hotchkiss got wind of this, so Hotchkiss gets a hold of Early and explains the plan to him and sells him on it. Now, those of you, I don't know how familiar you are, but there's a lot of tension between Jubal Early and John Gordon. Things had gone well for throughout the whole summer until September 20th. On September 20th, John C. Breckinridge, second in command of the Army of the Valley District, left the Valley to go defend Southwest Virginia against Union cavalry raids. Most important function that Breckinridge had is Gordon didn't report to Early. He reported to Breckinridge, and he was a buffer between the two men. They had a falling out because of actions at Gettysburg and the Battle of the Wilderness, where Early felt that they would have been more successful had Early only listened to what John Gordon wanted to do. So now that tension is going to flare up again. But to Jubal Early's credit, Jubal Early's got rheumatoid arthritis. He can't be making that hike up the mountain. And so he's got to rely largely on John Gordon and also the trusted Jed Hotchkiss. Hotchkiss was the guy that, reassured Early that, yeah, this plan looks really good. So the next day they would go back up there. This other division commander was not sold on this John Pegram. And so Early said, take Pegram up there with you. And they also took Brigadier General Clement Evans, a Georgian who had just returned, and he would be commanding Gordon's division during the upcoming battle. And so they go up there, and Clement Evans, when he's at Signal Knob, and I've hiked up there before, and you can look, and you're looking almost straight down there. And he wrote, Clement Evans writes home to his wife about the view from up there, how tremendous it is. And then he says, a man could jump all the way to the very bottom quite easily from Signal Knob, but of course with not much safety in that regard. But it's really pretty incredible when you're looking straight down over the edge. It's one of those places I'll naturally take a few steps backwards. But so they go, and everybody's convinced. It's fortunate they did. They saw that some of the Union troops had increased the entrenchments around the camps, and so they would make some last minute adjustments to Jubal Early's plan of attack here, the plan of attack that he adopted at the recommendation of Gordon and Hotchkiss. They would begin this attack on the evening of the 18th of October, 1864. At about 8 o'clock, John Gordon, in command of the 3 divisions of the old Second Army Corps. These are the remnants of Stonewall Jackson's army from Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. The troops who had been in the valley in 1862, there was only about a fragment of them. Of those thousands, that army from 62, after the Spotsylvania and Wilderness debacles, there was no more than 1,000 men left from the original Valley District Army. But the old Second Corps was there, and they'd cook rations, and they would march. So if you follow on the map here, right above the word Massanutten, you're going to see Gordon's night march. So he's going to march from Fisher's Hill, cross the Shenandoah River. One of the things the soldiers note about that is just how cold the river was that time. And the nights were getting very cold, and there was starting to be some frost out. And so it was a chilly night march. The men had left a lot of their equipment behind, and what they did take with them, Gordon issued orders to make sure that you didn't have metal clanking against metal, so that as they're marching along the knuckles of the Massanutten Mountain to get around the Union defenses here, they wouldn't be making a lot of noise. Al, I think we've been to a park right down here in the loop of the Shenandoah River when we've done a bus tour there, and we've looked up there at the mountains, up at the ridge where Earl Gordon's men are marching on the night of the 18th. They will arrive about 5 a.m. And here's in that water, one soldier noted that as cold as the water seemed the night before, that at 4 a.m. when they were crossing the North Fork of the Shenandoah River once again, it was even colder the next morning. Now, one of the division commanders under Gordon here was General Stephen D. Ramseur. Ramseur, young man in his mid to late 20s. His wife had just given birth to their first child. She had had a daughter, but he did not know it yet. During a break while the troops were crossing the river to get into position, Gordon rode up to him, and he told, and Ramseur calls out to him and says, "Well, General, after we get our victory today, I'll be expecting my leave of absence to go visit my newborn baby." He would not survive the coming battle, but he would go into battle wearing a flower on his lapel in honor of his child. All he knew at this point was that both mother and child were safe and healthy at that time. So the other wing of the army was going to be on the reinforced division that had joined the army under Joseph Kershaw. Kershaw is not going to leave until midnight, and he's going to be under the direct command of Jubal Early. Early's going to take 2 divisions out, and they are the larger one under Kershaw is going to march right through the town of Strasburg, and they won't leave until midnight. Soldiers talk about seeing children and ladies pressing their faces against the window pane as they went through the village of Strasburg that cold night, watching them march through. Gabriel Warden's troops would hold up on Hupp's Hill up here with all of the army's artillery, and they would wait until the rest of the army would launch its attack into the flank and rear of the Union troops. Now, Jubal Early himself, you see here next to Strasburg, you'll see the word Early, and Early's going to go with Kershaw's men down here to Bowman's Mill Ford. There's Bowman's Mill up here, and the ford was known as Bowman's Mill Ford. Now, Jubal Early, as Kershaw's division is crossing Cedar Creek and deploying over here into flatlands before moving to attack the division of Colonel Joseph Thoburn as it's sleeping there in the pre-dawn darkness, Early turns to one of his staff officers, and Early was a profane man, was not a very religious man. One of the few times that he was in church was early 1865, and his army had been wiped out, and he had about 8,000 men captured, killed, and wounded in fighting against Sheridan in the fall of '64. And the minister at the church asked a rhetorical questioning. He points out the window to the graveyard, a large graveyard outside of this church in Augusta County, and says, "What would you do if the Lord suddenly rose every man in that graveyard from their graves and brought them back to life?" And then old Jubal Early, he leans over to his staff officer, Colonel Samuel J.C. Moore. And early, you've all been at events where it's fairly quiet and someone thinks they're whispering, but they're really quite loud. He says, I'd conscript every goddamn one of them into the Army. So on the morning at Cedar Creek, as he's standing on this knoll, he looks at Samuel J.C. Moore, same guy who tried to get him into church after all these things had gone bad for him. Early looks at him and says, oh, to God, what a comfort it would be to only be able to pray like the mighty Stonewall Jackson did. So Early right there recognized, Jackson for all of his ways and things, that Jackson's faith gave him an inner strength and an inner peace that allowed him to get through these moments of tension. Well, the attack is getting ready farther over here, where at Bowman's Ford, where Gordon has deployed his 3 divisions, about 6,000 men. Kershaw has about 3,000. They're supposed to attack at 5 a.m. Well, Kershaw is going to attack about 5 minutes early. Why? Because Early was impatient and he's like, Gordon's late, tell Kershaw to go. So Kershaw will go momentarily before, and then Gordon will launch his attack a few minutes thereafter. But it would become a matter of debate, but Gordon was not late. Early jumped the gun and went a few minutes early because he had a lack of patience that morning. Needless to say, they will overrun easily all of the camps here under the command of George Crook and this brigade under Howard Kitching of about 2,000 men. So there's about 6,000, 7,000 Union troops that with almost outfiring a shot are going to lose most of their artillery, all their camp equipment. These troops were done fighting as an effective force for the rest of the day. Out of a total available force of about 6,000 to 7,000 men, they were able to get together about 1,500 men when Sheridan rallied the army at 10 o'clock in the morning after the fighting had subsided. So they are destroyed. These men had scattered to the 4 winds. Their commander, Colonel Thoburn, would be seriously wounded and die before the night was over. Now, once this attack clears the Valley Pike, Gordon is going to run into heavy resistance from the 19th Corps, General William Emory. Emory's going to start sending troops back towards the Valley Pike at the orders of General Horatio Wright. Horatio Wright's the acting Army commander. Phil Sheridan had just returned the previous evening from Washington, D.C., and spent the night at a hotel in Winchester, Virginia. And so the attacks there are going to take heavy losses, the Union counterattacks, but they're going to all be driven back. And the 19th Corps as well. It's going to be defeated, but it's not going to be dashed to the 4 winds in the same manner that George Crook's Army of West Virginia would suffer. But again, they will be driven back and they will be falling back in confusion. Now, as all these troops, Kershaw and Ramseur, all start filing back around Belgrove Plantation, it's at that point Jubal Early is going to give the order for Gabriel Worden to move forward and to bring the artillery up the Valley Pike and to begin deploying it to continue the fight. Now, at this point in the fight, Gordon and Kershaw are going to encounter the first serious resistance that they had come across, and it's going to come from the 6th Army Corps. There's a creek here. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger, because can you all see this is Cedar Creek right here? Can you see where I'm moving the cursor?
Yep.
There. That's Cedar Creek. And then flowing into it is Meadowbrook, which kind of roughly parallels the Valley Pike, which is over here. So once the Confederates crossed the Valley Pike and they've driven off the Army of West Virginia and the 19th Corps, they're going to have their first hard fight of the day, and that's going to come from the 6th Army Corps. Kershaw is going to swing around and he's going to fight the 3rd Division on the West Bank there. He'll be repulsed several times before he's able to drive off the divisions of 27-year-old Joseph Warren Kiefer and Brigadier General Frank Wheaton and force them back. Now, one of the things here that is going to happen is that as these Confederate troops are moving through these abandoned camps, they're seeing food, bacon, pork, coffee, tents, coats, blankets, everything they were lacking. And especially coming off having left so much behind them because of the nature of their stealthy night march, their needs were highly exacerbated. Remember, they had their last meal at 6 p.m. on the 18th. It's now about 6 a.m., 6:30 a.m. And these soldiers, they're going to do what comes naturally. They're cold. They're going to get jackets. They're hungry. They're going to get food from the Yankee camps. So that's going to have a process there of slowing down the Union advance. Now, here's another important, I don't like to talk about numbers too much, but the 2 main combat units are going to be Kershaw's division and the 2nd Corps under Gordon. Those 2 troops in and of themselves have no more than 9,000 effective fighting men in the ranks going into battle at Cedar Creek. Now, the Army of West Virginia, again, had 6,000 men or so. It had been reinforced by Kitching's brigade to the tune of another 1,000 or 2,000. So there's 7,000 or 8,000 men. The 19th Corps had over 10,000. The 6th Corps had slightly over 10,000. So Jubal Early's infantry is outnumbered 3-1 going into this battle. The only reason they've obtained success thus far was because of this flanking maneuver into the rear and flank of the Union Army by John Gordon and the 2nd Corps. So every time Kershaw runs into head-on into heavy resistance, Gordon's able to flank him. Well, that's until they run into the 6th Corps on the west bank of Meadowbrook, and that's where the fighting changes. Eventually, Kiefer and Wheaton are going to fall back, and all that's going to be left is the division of Brigadier General George Washington Getty, and it's going to fall back over here to the Cemetery Hill of Middletown, Virginia. Now, this stand of Getty is talked about as a turning point in the battle. And Getty does keep his division together and he does fight them. But what's happening there in the nature of the attacks, whereas previously all the attacks had succeeded because there was a head-on attack element, always with the strong, powerful flank movement from elements of Gordon's command coming in to flank and attack the Union troops in the rear and force the retreat. Here, when these attacks start against Getty, they're going to come in. The largest attack would be 2 brigades at one time. Why is this? Where are all these brigades at? You know, Gordon had a dozen brigades in his force, and he's only able to muster 4 of them, and not all at once, in the attack against Getty. It's also about this time that General Early will come onto the battlefield. And according to John Gordon in his memoirs, which he published after Jubal Early had already died, he claims that basically Early comes onto the battlefield and shuts everything down. And Gordon says, that's the 6th Corps. We need to attack them. And Gordon says, no, they will go to, Early says, no, they will go directly. And Early, according to John Gordon, Early says to him, General, just 1 month ago today, we were fleeing in confusion in the opposite direction. This is glory enough for one day. Now, that all makes for great prose in 1902 or 1904, whatever year that Gordon's book was published. But there's a lot of things you can criticize Early for, but I certainly do not buy that a tough old customer like Jubal Early is out here prancing around the battlefield saying, oh, it's enough glory for one day, boys. No, what's happening here is if you follow the course here, there's significant leakage in these units as they're flowing through here. And again, units are getting mixed up. They're becoming jumbled. Now, these guys, come 9 o'clock, which is about the time they start hitting Getty's position, they started the attack at 5 a.m. They've already been in 4 hours of significant combat. Do you remember what James Longstreet called the 3 hours of fighting at Gettysburg? He said it was the best fighting his men had ever done, and they did it for 3 hours. And he did that talking about what a feat it was to be in constant combat for that long a period of a time. So these 9,000 Confederates have already routed about 22,000 Union troops, starting at 5 a.m. with Crook's Corps, about 6 a.m. with the 19th Corps, and then about 6:30 to 7, they get 2/3 of the 6th Corps falling back in confusion. All of that is going to lead to chaos, confusion within the ranks, so that when they hit Getty at Cemetery Hill, one of the major reasons for Getty's success is these are piecemeal attacks. The finely tuned, coordinated flanking assault developed by Gordon and Hotchkiss had expended its momentum. And now all they were left was degenerating into piecemeal frontal assaults there. So at this point, the reality of the situation, and I'm talking between 9 and 10 a.m., the Army of the Valley District had lost its combat effectiveness. You'll have brigades from divisions, and there's one of the things here from a historians and interpretives perspective of this battle is there's not a lot of reports. Typically, you have an army commander reports, your corps commander reports, division, brigade, and regimental reports. Well, the few surviving reports that we have from the brigade and division level, we know that these units were getting mixed up at the higher level. So it's reasonable to assume that the lower level regimental units and things are likewise getting caught up in this confusion. It's going to take a significant amount of time for Early and his subordinates to get this army back into fighting shape. Again, the men were tired and hungry. So they will ultimately flank out to the west beyond Getty's right flank. By 10 o'clock, Getty is going to be falling back in confusion to a point about 2 miles north of this, well north of the town of Middletown. But what we really want to focus on tonight is what's going on with Jubal Early and John B. Gordon here. Well, this is at a point that's come to be known as the fatal halt. Was there a fatal halt? There certainly was a fatal halt, but as I discussed before, what were the reasons there? There were some very serious limitations. One was the paucity of numbers that Early had going into the battle. 2, after 4 hours of nonstop combat over rugged terrain and rapidly moving and routing more than double their own number of Union opponents. And remember, the general rule in the Civil War was if you're going to launch an attack, you better have a 3-to-1 advantage. So because of the ingenuity of the flanking design, they were able to overcome that paucity of numbers. So at about 10 o'clock, when Getty pulls off, Early and his subordinates, it's going to take them several hours to straighten all the troops out and to get the army back into position. And they are going to do so. They will advance once again 3 hours later at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. By then, Sheridan has arrived. Pretty much all of the 6th and 19th Corps, the hardcore fighting elements, the men know Sheridan's there. He's already ridden back and forth along the battle line, inspired the men. His ride down the pike brought thousands of men back to the ranks. So by the time they do advance 3 hours later, it's no longer a flanking advantage. it is going to be, here's the strong Union line, and when Early comes forward, he's coming straight at it. So it's no longer here. The biggest mistake that Jubal Early makes, and this is my opinion, having studied this battle for 32 years in depth now, is that Early, at this point, he's captured about 35 pieces of Sheridan's artillery, 1,500 prisoners of war, and untold, numbers of camp equipments, armaments, and things, everything that would be in an army's camp, and that he had here. His best option probably is, at that point, get all his captures and get away to Fisher's Hill and leave Sheridan with two black eyes trying to figure out what he needs to do next. But again, Early, part of the reason he got into trouble in September was that Early did not see the bigger picture of the war. He did not recognize with the coming presidential elections that his purpose in the Valley wasn't to hold every inch of ground and to hold as much territory as possible. His purpose there was, one, to be a decoy, and two, to make bad things happen to upset the morale of the Northern populace, because that was the biggest ally that the Southern Confederacy had at this point in the war. There. So, but nevertheless, this is where Early was not a Stonewall Jackson. I don't think Stonewall Jackson ever would have been caught up at 3rd Winchester and Fisher's Hill the way Jubal Early was, because that's at a point in a campaign when Jackson would have said, you know what, I'm going to head down to Cross Keys and Port Republic and see if I can get the enemy to divide their forces on either side of the Massanutten Mountain, try and get the terrain to work for me. He wasn't wed with staying up in the Winchester area. But Early, again, he still was more that frontline division combat leader, and he decides to push on. His 1 o'clock assault, so-called, would only really hit home on the far western end of the battlefield before they realized that the Union battle line was firmly reestablished out there with massive cavalry forces on both flanks. But Early, at this point, does nothing. He does not have the manpower to reinforce or strengthen his position. He knows that 2 times in the last 30 days, his army has been crushed by flank movements of the Union cavalry, and he sees that Union cavalry massing, especially under George Custer, off to his left flank, western flank, and John Gordon's warning him. But Early just sits there for 3 hours, sends out a few artillery batteries to help make things appear better. But it's almost like Early has already resigned, that he's going to wait and see. Maybe we've damaged the Union troops so deeply that they're just going to wait until dark and then they will fall back. They do not. This is Phil Sheridan. This isn't Nathaniel Banks. He turns around, counterattacks, and the rest is history. What had been the sun of Middletown in the early morning and a wonderful Confederate victory suddenly turned into the most embarrassing, lopsided rout that Stonewall Jackson's old Army of the Valley District had ever experienced. They would not lose as many men as they did at 3rd Winchester, but their spirit had been broken after this. And after the Battle of Cedar Creek, Early's army would come up. The Union officers wrote, he would bark at us a little bit, but the minute we turned and paid him any attention, he would go running back down the valley to the safety of Newmarket in the southern part of the Shenandoah Valley. The arguing would begin right away. Jubal Early realized that the key to the battle was where they lost the momentum at 10 o'clock and were unable to advance. Jed Hotchkiss was going to Richmond about a week or 2 after the battle, and Hotchkiss has a curious entry in his diary. He says, getting on the train for Richmond, before I left, General Early told me, don't tell General Lee that we should have advanced in the morning at Middletown, for we ought to have done so. So Early actually admitted that that was the point that there. Again, I don't think, his army was in condition to do that. But Early was going to come under a storm of criticism, politically oriented. John Gordon, ultimately in December, when the orders come for the Second Corps to return to the Army of Northern Virginia at Petersburg, Early is not removed of command. He is left in command of the Valley District, and John Gordon marches away now as the commander of the old Second Corps Army of Northern Virginia. Early is left with a rump command in the Shenandoah Valley that has about 1,500 infantry, a few artillery batteries, and a few hundred cavalry men. So he's not been removed of command, but he knows that he is fallen out of favor. And it was only because Lee had recognized what immense odds that Early was up against that he did not formally remove him from command. Now, Early's going to be under a lot of pressure, both in the media at the time, and I'm sure old Jube was complaining about fake news in the aftermath of the Battle of Cedar Creek. And John Gordon was out there, saying, hey, Early blew it. Early makes, in terms of dealing with the fallout of the defeat, in the media relations aspect and the political side of that as an army commander, Early just was not equipped to deal with that. And he makes a fatal mistake. And that is, he starts blaming the men in the ranks because they went back into the camps looking for food, looking for uniforms, getting coffee, supplies, whatever they could get their hands on. And therefore, when that army needed to move at 10 o'clock in the morning, they were unable to do so. There was a lot of truth to that, and that's a major reason that this army grinds to a halt, and all the jumbled units from the rapid pursuits over the jumbled terrain. But Early makes a mistake there, because I think most of the men would have been inclined to have understood, the men who were there understood the odds that were against them. But when he turned and started blaming the rank and file for looting the camps and saying that was the cause of the defeat, while again, indeed, it was a contributing factor, tactically that lost him a lot of allies, both at the time and more so amongst the veterans during the post-war years. They were reading these memoirs and writing into the Confederate Veteran and the Southern Historical Society papers. I think there's a lot of people who may have otherwise been predisposed to have looked kindly upon Early, but for the fact that he tried to blame the rank and file for the defeat at the Battle of Cedar Creek. As for John Gordon, he's a exemplary commander, an excellent tactician. He did great on the offensive here, but as one of the artillery officers observed, that when he's on the offensive, he's like unchained lightning. But when he's put in a defensive position, his actions left much to be desired. And there was some allusions that Gordon's division collapsed at Cedar Creek without making much effort to resist the Union counterattack at the end of the day. So, well, again, Jubal Early would maintain command of the Valley District until March 2nd of 1865, when Sheridan would come down with his 3 cavalry divisions and wipe out Jubal Early at the Battle of Waynesboro. And it's going to be at that point that Robert E. Lee formally removes him of his command, although his command had been completely captured by Sheridan at that point, and there was nothing left to command. But as a fitting tribute to Jubal Early, in May of 1865, after the war has ended, Robert E. Lee thought enough of old Jube to write him a letter. And in that letter, he tells him, basically says, there was too much political pressure after the Waynesboro disaster. I had to cut you loose. I understand what you were up against. I understand that in hindsight, but he just said the political pressure against Jubal Early was immense. And so not even Robert E. Lee at that point could have intervened. And again, at that point, that's only about 5 weeks before the war actually ends. So there would have been much for old Jube to have done at that point. So in spite of all this, General Robert E. Lee recognized that if it had not been for Jubal Early, the war may have ended in the late summer of early fall. If Early's actions in the Shenandoah Valley and at Washington, the Washington raid, had not forced General Grant to dispatch Sheridan and 30,000 men from the Union efforts at Petersburg. So, well, thank you all for tuning in tonight.